We know that history is written by the victors, and seldomly has this saying been more true than in the case of the Emperor Maxentius. Basically, almost all knowledge of this emperor comes from the propaganda of Constantine, who went to very great lengths in order to ensure not only the complete eradication of Maxentius's memory, but also to vilify him and present him as an absolute tyrant. But slowly, more research is coming out that Maxentius might actually have been a good emperor. Actually, we could say the last real Roman emperor, for he chose to live in Rome and build the last great buildings in the Eternal City in a time where others had forsaken the great city of their forefathers, preferring instead to rule from Mediolanum or Augusta Treverorum or Nicomedia. But Maxentius chose Rome, and this video is an attempt to show how Maxentius probably really was and to restore his character that has been unjustly vilified by Constantine and his successors, and also by the vast majority of scholars for more than 1,700 years. When we talk about what Roman emperors or other important characters of Roman history did, we must always keep in mind that our understanding of those characters is purely based on written accounts. There was neither film nor camera back then, and so the only way as how to record events for all eternity was to write them down. So therefore, how a character is portrayed will very much depend on how the historian writing about that character saw him. Did he think positively or negatively about him? What biases did the writer have? Did the writer hold a grudge against the person he was writing about? And so it becomes very easily understandable why we must be so careful not to confuse our understanding of a historic person with how the person really was. Because our understanding might be based on incomplete or biased sources, or both. And so it then happened that some characters of Roman history were painted either in a much too positive or much too negative light, depending on the surviving sources. And for nobody else was this possibly more true than for Maxentius, the emperor that would only be remembered by history because he lost to Constantine at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the battle that would decide the fate of the world. But before we get to that, who was Maxentius? He was born as son to Maximian in 283 AD, who would shortly later reign as one of the 4 emperors of Diocletian's tetrarchy. In 305, when Diocletian and Maximian abdicated, Maxentius and Constantine were passed over for the roles of Caesar, junior emperors. And so Maxentius went to live in a villa in the vicinity of Rome. But already in 306, he was proclaimed emperor at Rome. I talked in more detail about what happened in this older video here. For 6 years would Maxentius remain emperor in Rome, the old heart of the empire. And this choice was 100% conscious. In a time where the emperors increasingly neglected the old capital, neglecting the old senate, Maxentius chose Rome, not only for the symbolic power of a new second founding of Rome, but also because, differing from the other emperors, he would respect the voice of the Senate and of the people of Rome. Ruling from Rome meant demonstrating that one was willing to accept a mechanism of balancing of powers which the absolute despots, who wished to reign far away from the capital, did not accept. Unlike Diocletian and the other generals of humble origins raised in the army, Maxentius was a senator, and therefore probably had a different institutional respect. In his short 6 years of reign, he would defeat 2 emperors marching against him, once Severus in 306 and once Galerius in 307. He would put down a rebellion in Africa in 310. He would contain Licinius and prevent him from entering Istria. And he would embark on the greatest building project that Rome had seen since the times of Trajan. He wanted a rebirth of Rome, a second founding, and this should be reflected in his massive building program. Even to this day, we still have not a full picture of all the buildings that Maxentius built in Rome. He built a giant basilica in the Forum Romanum, a monumental building of vast interior proportions. Then he built a temple, also in the Forum Romanum, which would be known as the Temple of Romulus, named after his deceased son, and he would build his family tomb and a giant circus outside of Rome. But still today, other building projects of Maxentius are not fully discovered, or it is often forgotten that it was actually Maxentius who was behind them. For instance, the Temple of Venus and Roma was almost completely destroyed by a fire in 307 and completely rebuilt from the ground up by Maxentius, even larger and more magnificent than before. The ruins of the Temple of Venus and Roma that we see today is actually what Maxentius had built. He added a splendorous reception palace in front of the Temple of Venus and Roma, wrongly attributed as the Terme di Elagabalus, but this was likely a Maxentian building. And he might have actually been the one who built the Arch of Janus, a theory which has been proposed by Marco Ciccini and Gianluca Grigori in a fascinating paper, link in the description. But even more, the fact that Severus as well as Galerius could not take Rome was because Maxentius actually increased the height of the Aurelian walls. Previously, they had been only 6 to 8 meters in height, and Maxentius significantly increased that height so that the city could not be stormed over the walls. Thus Maxentius really was a builder of the order of Trajan or Augustus, a builder of the stature of the old emperors, such as Rome had not witnessed in 2 centuries. It is a sad fact of history that only few of the buildings that he built are attributed to him, but most of his building projects are forgotten. And under Maxentius, Rome would actually for the last time ever see such a building activity of grand imperial buildings, because as we know, Constantine would forsake Rome. In the following 200 years, if new buildings were built, it would be almost exclusively new churches, and they would always use building material of nearby damaged pagan buildings that were deemed unworthy of repair. Under Maxentius indeed, Rome would reach its zenith of impressive building activity. But even more interestingly, Maxentius was and often still is completely misrepresented by most scholars. One of the worst adaptations I ever saw about Maxentius was the 2006 BBC docudrama about Constantine. Here he was presented how unfortunately he is presented all too often, a stupid, arrogant tyrant. Hilarious that the BBC is actually falling for the Constantinian propaganda 1700 years later. The real Maxentius was actually probably a very remarkable person, whose memory and legacy has been systematically destroyed by Constantine's propaganda, and all sources that we have about Maxentius are actually only the later Constantinian sources, such as Eusebius or Lactantius, because previous sources were systematically destroyed. And since Maxentius was the enemy of the great Constantine, who would later be praised as the deliverer of Christianity, you can imagine what happened to Maxentius's memory. And if you are a Rome nerd like me, and chances are pretty high that you are if you are watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase if you type in the rebate code Maiorianus. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. So how was the real Maxentius then? Thanks to a man called Marco Ciccini, I personally could learn a lot more about how the real Maxentius probably was. Marco is in my opinion one of the great experts on the topic, and I am using some of his papers for this video here. He does some absolutely incredible reenactments of Maxentius and of the late Roman times in the 4th century, and you can see that the level of detail with regards to the clothing and armor he uses is absolutely incredible. Of course, I linked to his YouTube channel and to his Facebook page in the description. I highly recommend you to check it out. Now, thanks to Marco and his insights, I could learn a lot about how Maxentius probably was as a real person. What fascinated me is that, unknown to many, Maxentius was born to a Syrian woman, Eutropia, and hence quite likely raised in an open-minded cultural environment of Neoplatonism, theurgy, Chaldean astrology and Egyptian mysteries, and thus very versed in philosophy and religious understanding. And it was this very understanding that made him a great benefactor of the traditional cults at Rome, but quite possibly also a great benefactor of medicine. Unbeknownst to most, and possibly very much inspired due to his knowledge of philosophy, Maxentius, turns out, was likely a great benefactor to medicine. This fascinating theory was published by Marco Cecchini and Diego Serra in a paper, link in the description. They have proposed that many of the building projects carried out by Maxentius were such as to create a medical district in Rome, and as to reconfigure Vespasian's Temple of Peace, the Templum Pacis, as a scientific and medical center of the city. It might be that the death of Maxentius' son Romulus at the young age of 9 or less from a sickness strengthened Maxentius' interest in medicine. The loss of his son was a brutal blow to him because he wanted to create a new dynasty that would bear the name of Romulus, the founder of Rome. Indeed, that name was symbolically chosen because under Maxentius, Rome would be reborn again as the old new center of the empire, and Romulus would be the first of a new dynasty of emperors that would rule from Rome as in the old days, from the traditional heart of the Imperium Romanum, from where it all had started 1,000 years earlier. So the loss of his son made him interested in medicine because he was then filled with a deep wish to prevent such tragedies from happening. Thus, a new body of publicly financed state doctors was introduced, very likely by Maxentius, as this body of doctors was mentioned later in a legislation by Valentinian I, but very likely dates from the time of Maxentius. The choice of Rome as his capital was also symbolic from another perspective, because Rome was the traditional seat of the old pagan gods, as he was himself very much a traditionalist, but in the context of a Neoplatonic philosophy. It might surprise us thus to find that it was Maxentius who resisted the persecutions of Christians in the reigns of Diocletian and Maximian. Diego Serra and Marco Cecchini have published a paper in November 2022 in which they detailed the remarkable findings of 2 letters by Maxentius found by the 2 researchers at the Marciana Library in Venice. Link to the paper in the description. Diego and Marco have compared these letters to other documents from the era, even to 2 constitutions by Diocletian and Maximian, which to date have never been analyzed before. And what they found is a quite astounding picture that you will certainly not be able to read on Wikipedia. And please consider supporting this channel via Patreon or YouTube membership, because I really need your help in order to be able to continue this work on late Roman history. Without your support, I don't know how much longer I can continue this channel, because as you can imagine, the YouTube algorithm does not exactly push a niche topic such as late Roman history. Alternatively, you can help this channel by buying my merch directly here on YouTube. I have created a merch store with some cool or funny or weird late Roman merch, which you can buy directly here via YouTube in the video description. Thank you very much. The picture, in fact, emerges that Maxentius opposed the persecutions of Diocletian and Maximian. Maxentius overturned Diocletian's vote in the Senate of Rome, thus assuming judicial powers comparable to those of Diocletian himself, an affront that made him a public enemy of the Tetrarchy. In this light, the following Edict of Toleration of Constantine then in fact would be nothing more than a normative collection of the documents produced up to then on the subject of toleration of Christianity by none other than Maxentius himself. Maxentius's forgotten Edict of Tolerance was probably issued between 306 and 308, and in light of that, the strong standing of the Catholic Church in Rome during the time of Maxentius against the Donatists in Africa now makes more sense, since the Church would have the backing of the Emperor of Rome himself, of Maxentius. It is quite astounding that apparently Maxentius was the only one of the emperors of the era to openly take a stand against the persecution of Christianity. Now, why then would this fascinating finding of Diego and Marco have been forgotten by history? Why would Maxentius later be painted as the enemy of Christianity, a tyrant, an unfair ruler under which the people of Rome suffered? Before we get to that, we know that the fate of the world was decided on October 28th of the year 312. The tetrarchical system was fundamentally unstable and open war was just a question of time. Severus and Galerius both marched on Rome and both times Maxentius emerged victorious, remarkably with possibly little bloodshed, as the armies mostly voluntarily switched sides to Maxentius, persuaded by the imperial authority of the House of Maximian and by assurances of higher pay, and also deterred by the now increased height of the Maxentian addition to Aurelian's walls of Rome. However, Constantine proved not so easy to persuade, and he waged a systematic war, invading Italy and taking town after town. We can see here already that the myth of the evil tyrant Maxentius cannot be true, because the supporters of Maxentius fought with a vigor and zealousness that would not be possible if he was a hated tyrant. Only with great difficulties could Constantine conquer Turin and Verona and the other large cities of the north. In fact, Mediolanum was the only city of northern Italy that voluntarily switched sides to Constantine. Hardly a sign that most of the people hated Maxentius. But Constantine's experienced troops took city after city in the north until he arrived at Rome. Maxentius was now presented with a choice. Would he stay in Rome and risk a long siege, possibly the outbreak of diseases and the death of tens of thousands of Romans? His name would be forever tainted. So he chose to engage Constantine in open combat. Here too, we cannot trust the later sources. Of course, Eusebius would paint Constantine's victory as a divine intervention, and that Constantine was outnumbered by Maxentius. This too might be nothing more than Constantinian propaganda. In fact, it is quite likely that it was Maxentius who was outnumbered. Constantine had battle-hardened troops who had fought many battles in Britannia and Germania, whereas Maxentius could only rely on troops from the Italic and African provinces that had not seen regular war engagements. Constantine had likely around 35 to 40,000 men when he arrived at Rome, whereas there are many indications that Maxentius possibly only had 20 to 25,000 men at his disposal, most of which were, as said, untrained troops. Even the 10,000 Praetorian troops had not seen real battle, as they were traditionally stationed at the Castra Praetoria. So a picture emerges where Maxentius was actually the outnumbered one. Maxentius chose the 28th of October as the day of battle, because that was exactly the day of his ascension to emperor 6 years prior, the day of his Adventus. This was also the day on which the death and resurrection festivities of the Egyptian god Osiris started, and since Maxentius was likely influenced by Egyptian religion, this might also have been a factor in his decision to choose that date. Now, in light of these numbers, it is quite easy to understand why Maxentius lost. He might have been outnumbered by Constantine 35 to 25, and Constantine had the more experienced battle-hardened troops. Maxentius's troops panicked at some point, and chaos ensued. Here again, it is fascinating though that the Praetorian Guards fought with a martial vigor and tenacity which I think is not possible if Maxentius had been an unjust tyrant. It is quite clear that the Praetorians fought for their emperor like absolute zealots, but they were outnumbered. It was therefore that Constantine disbanded the Praetorians after his victory, destroying the memory of this ancient order that reminded him all too much of his enemy Maxentius. In fact, and this is my own theory, so take it with a grain of salt, I think that Constantine wanted to eradicate all memory of Maxentius and his achievements, because deep within he might have envied his achievements. Maxentius was the one who likely issued the Edict of Toleration towards Christianity, and it was Maxentius who built the most impressive and monumental buildings that Rome had seen since the times of Trajan. In my opinion, Constantine might have been filled with envy, and this also explains his utter hate for Maxentius and the ensuing damnatio memoriae, where Maxentius was after Constantine's victory erased from most inscriptions and statues. Constantine then reissued Maxentius' Edict of Toleration, finished the buildings that Maxentius had begun, and made Maxentius' achievements his own. I think also that it is no coincidence that Constantine gave up on Rome, betrayed Rome, turned his back on the old capital that his enemy had wanted to restore to old glory, because he wanted to do the exact opposite of what Maxentius had done. He would become an anti-Maxentius in every way, because Maxentius would have never given up on Rome, and so Constantine would build a new city named after him, because in Rome everything reminded him of his enemy. Constantine's chroniclers, Eusebius and Lactantius, then of course portrayed Maxentius, the enemy of the victorious Constantine, in the most negative light possible, as to completely destroy the name and legacy of Maxentius. The propagandist writers portrayed Maxentius as a sorcerer and magician, superstitious and prone to devilish rituals. Behind these colorful, denigrating descriptions of propaganda lies probably the truth of a man who had abandoned himself to fate and divine will. Eusebius places a very strong emphasis on the witchcraft and necromancy of Maxentius, as do other sources, and this could lead back to the rites of theurgy, typical of Syriac Neoplatonism. And the Constantinian propaganda was so successful that even to this day very little is known about the real Maxentius, and still he is far too often portrayed as an evil tyrant, as can for instance impressively be seen in the BBC docudrama from 2006 that I mentioned before. Thanks to the research of Marco Ceccini and his colleagues, we can hopefully restore the memory of a man who was unjustly vilified by history and who was actually a tolerant person, well versed in religious matters and Neoplatonic philosophy, tolerant towards Christianity, possibly a benefactor of medicine, and a prolific builder of the likes the Romans had not seen since Trajan, and a great supporter of Rome, the traditional heart of the empire. We can only imagine what would have happened had Maxentius won. The world as we know it would very likely be a different place, and I strongly suspect that Rome would have again emerged as a resurging seat of the Roman Empire, reclaiming its old seat as the capital of the Imperium, and the city would have been expanded and beautified with new buildings and monuments that we can't even imagine. And the betrayal of the Romans would not have happened. Constantinople would not have happened. How that world would look, I will theorize in another video. I would again like to thank Marco Ceccini and his excellent research on the topic and his help, without which I could not have made such a detailed video about Maxentius. I hope I can also contribute a bit to Marco's excellent research and reenactments of Maxentius in order to restore the memory of an emperor that has been unjustly vilified by history. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support, since this channel does not generate a lot of revenue on its own. Seriously, this channel would not work without our amazing Patreon and YouTube members. I'm not just saying that. And I want to thank each and every one who is supporting this channel in any form. Gratias tibi ago, amici.